All right, all right. So, welcome. Thank you everyone so much. I know it's absolutely freezing outside, and I'm so glad that you are here today to hang out with me so we can learn some really cool things about React. My name is Haris. I'm a front-end developer at Shopify, previously at TLBG with these awesome folks, instructing with those awesome folks back there. There's lots of familiar faces, lots of awesome friends in the crowd. I run a little education platform called DevToast, and also a enamel pin business, sort of like one of these for like the tech scene and for the startup scene, called Rapid Supply. So that's a little bit about me. Today we'll be chatting about the React story and the ecosystem. Now, for the peeps in the audience, how many of you folks have never touched React before? Dope. How many of you have touched just React but nothing else around it? Dope. And so we know there were some Redux people in the audience. That's really, really cool. How many people are sort of still like early in the JavaScript days and still learning, still getting like the hang of things? All right, cool, cool. And how many people are like, legit, we got this? All right, cool, yeah. You got, awesome. So the reason why I wanted to ask is just not for my benefit, but for the benefit of all of you to see the difference and the wide range of knowledge and understanding that is sitting in this room here today. So, like, I'm not a ninja, I'm not a wizard, I'm not an expert, but I have had a lot of experiences in the past little while that I've able to learn a whole bunch of stuff from. Whether that was building projects myself, asking a ton of questions, spending endless hours Googling and Stack Overflowing. Whatever it was, I've learned a whole bunch in this process, and that's what I'm here to share with you today. Okay, so some time ago, probably around 2011-ish, this small company called Facebook had to build this thing called chat. They were on this venture where they were building chat. And early on, it looked like this. That's sort of like all it was. And you know, just back and forth, very, very easy to manage. They're like, oh, cool, we got this. This is nice. Soon they incorporated notifications in that top menu bar. You now had this little messages icon telling you how many notifications you had. All right, so things get a little bit more complex. Interesting. You have to keep track of what's read, what's not read, update that counter to make sure everyone's getting informed appropriately, push notifications, blah, blah, blah. Things start to increase in complexity in and around all the chaos that already is Facebook. And then they bring in the entire messaging system. It expands even further, and things just get really, really complex. There's lots and lots of issues. The code that they were writing felt a little bit fragile. And then there was this bug. I don't know if any of you remember this. In 2011, 2012-ish, there was this bug where you'd be told that you have a message. You're like, oh, I've got a notification. You click it, and nothing's in there. You're like, oh, that's weird. You click away, and it still says 1. And it would drive me bonkers. It was the most annoying thing ever. And I was like, you know what? I'm done. Just like, count me out. No more internet for me, I'm done. Facebook is driving me batshit crazy. I don't want to do this anymore. But with repeated fixes, that bug kept coming back over and over and over again. It was extremely frustrating for the devs at Facebook to try and resolve this. And this was a constant pain point for a lot of their users too, because this is such a huge part of Facebook. How could it be continuously buggy? So they knew that something needed to change. They needed to develop some new tools that will allow them to develop these concepts, reducing the amount of bugs, making sure it was scalable, making sure they could continuously add more functionality without making it super fragile, and making sure that the development remained rapid. As more and more developers joined Facebook, they needed to be able to like learn what they needed to do and get up and running super, super fast. And this sort of like launched this whole venture with the developers at at Facebook, sorry, thank you, to try and figure out what they could do with this. And two things came out of that, like React and Flux, and we'll be diving into a whole bunch of this stuff today. So now I apologize if some of this stuff is review, but you know, it's always nice to get different perspectives, and it's sort of like, you know, you're following me on this little journey of mine. So React comes around, and the first thing that I really liked about it personally was that you can just stick it in anywhere. It's like doesn't have to be this massive, massive thing that you have to like build your entire thing with. It could just be like a tiny little component, little widget, little section, maybe just like a sidebar on your entire website. And I absolutely loved that. So you could just like render whatever you wanted just in the get element by ID root. So if you had a div somewhere sitting on your website or anything that had an ID or root, just that little piece would be reactified and everything else would just remain as it was. Awesome. So you can drop it into Rails projects, static websites, WordPress websites. Fantastic. I loved that. Cool. The second thing that they were like very enthusiastic about was that it is the V in MVC. It's just the view. I was like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Just speak to me in English. And at the end of it, like at the core of it, all it meant was that you use it to build user interfaces. And everything else was sort of left up to you to figure out how you wanted to go about doing so. That was kind of interesting. So it was intended to be very, very simple, extremely, extremely watered down. And some of like the main concepts that came along with React was one-way data flow. And this is very different than the mindset that existed at that time with things like Angular. So you had your state or your data, and based on that data, you would render something in your UI. Someone interacts with the UI. It doesn't just update the UI itself. It sends that information and all those details back to your state or back to your data. That updates, and based on those updates, your UI changes again. So the things that you're changing, like the buttons that you're clicking, aren't updating the buttons themselves. They're updating the data sitting higher up. And that data decides how things need to appear. So that's sort of like the magical React circle. Then there's this thing called the virtual DOM. I was like, okay, virtual DOM, feeling a little bit matrixy. What does this mean? In-memory data structure, still don't know what you're talking about. Only re-renders change DOM. I was like, okay, I need to break this down and figure out what the heck is happening. Let's say you've got tons and tons of layers of data. You've got lots and lots of markup, and one particular piece needed to change. To traverse through HTML and actually determine what has changed, it can be pretty expensive. So what React does, it creates like a fake version of that DOM in its memory, which is a lot easier to go through, a lot easier to parse, and then it can determine what, if anything, has changed. And then it knows just to find those elements in the real DOM and just update those. So that's where the virtual DOM concept came from. Pretty cool. Then there was this thing called JSX. We spoke about this earlier. JavaScript syntax, you're writing HTML in your JavaScript. HTML in my JavaScript. Okay. Nope. When I saw this for the first time, I was like, no. I was not happy. I was so confused. I was like, what the hell is happening? My entire life, since I was born, I was told that I need to worry about CSS and CSS files. HTML goes over here. My JavaScript goes over here. And now you're throwing all this stuff together and giving me this nonsense. This is absolutely bonkers. I was 100% confused. I was like, I don't like this at all. It was just so gross. And a lot of discussions that I had with fellow developers also had very, very similar sentiments. They were like, it's so gross looking. You just felt dirty writing code like this. You're like, ooh, like you've been told for so much time that that's not the way to do it, and now all of a sudden, like, no, that is the best way to do it, or that is the expected way to do it. It was very, very, very bizarre. Now, in this time, JavaScript became extremely, extremely prominent. Browsers got extremely powerful. JavaScript in itself sort of like exploded and became incredibly, incredibly valuable and powerful. There was sort of a time when I was early in my development years where front-end development wasn't considered as a very serious field. Quite often, the designers would pass off stuff to the front-end developers, and all we'd be in charge of is making things look pretty, and then we would pass it off to the back-end devs, and they would be like, they're like the engineers who make, make things happen and make it all functional. Yeah, it was pretty awkward being in the middle. Like no one really, took that role very, very seriously. But as JavaScript became more and more powerful, you could do so much more in the browser and so much more with like the web-based technologies that we had available to us. Now, one framework in particular got a lot of extra attention, and that was Angular at this point in time. During this time, like 2011-ish, Angular is super, super popular. It's being adopted by a large number of companies as like the way to go. This is the future. When you said single-page app, people assumed you meant Angular. They sort of became synonymous with each other. That was like, extremely, extremely popular until they made one mistake, until Google made one mistake. They made an announcement about Angular. And the announcement came too early. That was the problem. That was the crux of the issue. A new version is coming of Angular. And I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. At the crux, we were like, dope. Yeah, that's sweet. But they said that, hey, it's going to be very, very different than Angular 1. And they provided absolutely no transition path at this point in time on how you would migrate your apps from Angular 1 to Angular 2. It's like, okay, if I'm a developer who has an app that's in Angular 1, you're not going to help me transition. You're obviously not going to be supporting Angular 1 too much. What the heck do I do? That puts me in a very, very awkward position. And last but not least, they were like, oh, it's also 1 year away. So, they kind of like shot themselves in the foot because that was just like a really shitty place to be in. You're like, okay, if I'm a developer and I need to start a brand new project today, let's say I work at an agency, we have a client, we need to start building something, this is for the long term. Why would I don't know what to decide anymore. Do I pick Angular 1 that I know is no longer going to be potentially supported a year from now? I don't even know what that transition path looks like. I have no idea what Angular 2 looks like. So you're sort of put in this like weird, awkward state trying to figure out what you need to do. And those tech decisions that were being made sort of led to the adoption of React. That was one of the main reasons why people started to take React seriously and started to look at it as a valuable contender for the web application and development industry. Now, at this point in time, though, React was just solving one particular piece of the puzzle. As they mentioned, that they were very, very focused on just being the V in MVC, just focusing on building UI. Cool, but websites and web applications are more than just UI. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes around it. Now, with that in mind, people were like, oh, hey, we can build all those components and all those additional things around it ourselves, the way that we need them to. And that's sort of when things got crazier and crazier with tons of new ways to implement this particular thing or that particular thing just spiraled out of control, and more frameworks were coming out day by day. There was a new framework out before I had sworn next. It was just insane. One of the things that came about in the early times was something called Flux. This was developed by Facebook. The reason why I put that in quotes is because it's not really a thing, it's more of a concept. The concept is sort of like about how information flows inside your app. That was very, very important to build things that could scale in the future. When you have one or two tiny things, no problem. When you're building Facebook, big problem. You need to make sure that everyone on the team understands how data is flowing inside this massive world that is Facebook. So you've got your view, and it triggers an event, and the events end up updating the model. The model triggers another event, and then your view responds and re-renders accordingly using the virtual DOM and blah, blah, blah. So we already looked at this, but this is sort of at its core what Flux was about. And over time, one of the most popular adaptions of the Flux concept was with something called Redux. And Anna spoke about this earlier, so moving on. Cool. So another thing that was extremely valuable in this time was something called ES 2015. Or ES6, lots of different names, whatever. It was essentially JavaScript got super sexy. It was no longer just like meh, it was like, ooh, all right, this is kind of cool. You can do a whole bunch of stuff that you couldn't before. There was substantial amount of developments. And one of the things that was extremely, extremely awesome was ES6 classes. And now, any of the engineers or people who had been working with server-side technologies, they were like, classes, you're excited about classes? We've had those for forever. Everyone else was like, whatever, class is big deal. But Java was like, classes! Finally, we have amazing. The syntax was cleaner. It was a lot easier to create inheritances. I'm just going to show you a quick code sample. We don't really have to dive into it too much, but just to show you like a compare and contrast between the two. So with ES5, or like the older version of JavaScript, let's say you had a thing called person. You created a thing called person, and the person had a person method on it as well. And then you wanted to create an employee, which was a kind of person that had more things associated to said employee. So you would have like a whole bunch of garbagey looking code. It was very gross. It wasn't very obvious. It was like excessively verbose. You had a whole bunch of repeating stuff over and over again. And if something needed to, go down further, like a manager was a type of employee that is a type of a person, things just got even crazier. Your code just didn't feel very, very clean. Whereas in ES6, things become a lot more legible. It became a lot more easy to read, a lot more understandable when you first look at it, especially for those coming from a more of an engineering background or a server-side technologies background. We're like, oh, cool, like this stuff makes sense. It's a lot easier to understand. So similarly, once again, we now have a person class, and if we wanted to have an employee that sort of extends a person, the code looks very, very clean. We have an employee that extends a person. It takes on a lot of the things that a person had in its constructor, and then has the employee method. And we don't have to dive too much into this, but sort of just wanted to illustrate the difference in like code cleanliness and just like the obviousness as to what it was doing. One thing I would highly recommend is for anyone interested in JS in general is to dive into ES6. It really, really strengthens you and future-proofs you as a developer in the JavaScript community. And one of my favorite ways to do so is by following the legend, the rock star himself, Wes Boss. Just hit up es6.io. It's an absolutely incredible course. I thought I knew ES6. I did his course. There was a whole bunch of shit that I didn't know. So it's very, very valuable, extremely, extremely awesome course. All right. So there's this other thing called a React router. This comes around. It's a routing library. I'm like, okay, cool. It's very nice because the syntax for routing this stuff is very similar to React's syntax. Cool. So I'm not learning a brand new syntax. Still looks like React, fits into React. But what the heck are you talking about? What am I actually doing with this? What you're doing is you're matching routes and URLs. So you have code that looks similar to this. And what you're essentially doing is you're saying that when someone hits particular URLs that look like that, or if the route in your URL has a path that looks something similar to this, what we want you to do is load those components. That's it. That was the concept of React Router at its very, very core. You're able to load and like render different components based on your URL structure at any given point in time. And you could be pretty dynamic. So you'd notice that over here, the last highlighted path was user/user ID. So you could pass in dynamic IDs, and it would load the appropriate user given that ID. Very neat. That was it. Then came Webpack. Webpack gained a lot of popularity during this time as React grew because of all like the crazy little things that people were developing in and around it. They needed a way to tie it all in together. It was a build tool. I was like, all right, cool. When I started looking into this, I was like, cool. I saw like the nice, beautiful image on their website. They were like, oh, you've got all these different things and these modules that have interdependencies, and we just, like turn them into like nice static files. I was like, cool. Then I looked at their docs and their setup, and I was like, nope, not happening. This is ridiculous. It was so confusing for me. But what I did realize as I was forced to dive in deeper is that it's extremely, extremely powerful. The learning scale is so steep. It's incredibly difficult to fully master and understand all the capabilities of Webpack just because of its complexity, but it's so powerful. So if you do end up spending a little bit of time learning how it's working, learning what it's doing, it can be extremely valuable to larger applications. Now, Facebook did realize that things were getting a little bit crazy, a little bit out of hand, or all those folks working on the React library. So Create React App came around at that point, simplifies the entire process, gives you a couple of things that you need to get up and running. This was probably my absolute favorite thing that they released. I was like, all those extra niceties are fantastic, but if I'm too intimidated or too scared to worry I'm going to like mess something up, this makes my life way easier. And Ksenia spoke about this earlier in the talk, in the day. React Dev Tools were super awesome. They let you explore your DOM not as the regular DOM, but as React components and see their props and state and all that good stuff. Super fun. Redux has something similar where you could, as Anna put it, travel back in time and go through all the different states that your app was in. Very helpful to try and figure out where your application sits at any given time. React Native was a game changer. Mobile dev at this point was either being done in Java if you were doing Android development, or in C# or Swift if you were doing iOS. Now, I lean more towards the iOS side of things. I have an iPhone, I have an iMac. So I looked into this a little bit, and I had to open up Xcode, and I was like, nope. It was so gross. I was like, what the hell is going on here? For a company that cares a lot about their UX and like their development ecosystem, like Xcode was disgusting for me. I was like, ooh, nope, I do not enjoy this. Has anyone tried to ever change the font size of Xcode? I still don't know. Yeah. Moving on. So similar to the React Create app thing, we also have the React Native equivalent. So you're able to initialize a brand new app using React Native. Now, this is really cool. It would set up an Xcode project for you, get everything you need up and running, and boom, you've got like this project that builds onto your iPhone that you write JavaScript in. I was like, interesting. That's really, really cool. So you've got your import statements that you normally would if you're building a web app. You've got import React, but now you have a whole bunch of things that you're importing from React Native. And you'll notice those things are called like style sheet and image and view. And those are all like the very, very high-level containers and concepts and modules that you need to build a mobile app, but still writing in JavaScript. So your code doesn't look very different when you're building a mobile app. So this is what it would look like instead. You've got the same render method, you've got a return statement, you've got React-like code, and you've got a whole bunch of these things, and that's sort of like the things that we had imported from React Native. Just predefined modules that you can bring in to render different things in your app. Very, very cool. There was also this thing called React Accessibility, or A11Y. And quite often, people just assume that it just magically makes your React app accessible. Nope. It provides warnings. So in your console, as you're developing, if you've missed something, it'll give you a warning in your console letting you know that something is amiss in this particular component. Maybe you should go fix it and have a look. You're still responsible for making sure your app is accessible. This is extremely, extremely important, so you have to definitely set aside time to make sure that this is so. And in your console, like I mentioned, you'd see things like, oh, you know, the role is missing. Screen readers may not be aware of what this component is supposed to do or how they're going to interact with this. So it would give you this awesome feedback, and this really, really helped me as I was trying to like navigate the world of React and making sure my stuff was accessible. So the popularity of React continues to grow, and more frameworks and libraries are just like tooling in and around the web development systems or web development industry. We're like, oh, we need to find ways to make our stuff more accessible to React developers and make our stuff port easily into React apps so people use our stuff. So people started developing wrappers around their products or abstractions. And Bootstrap was one of, Bootstrap and Foundation were both like the CSS framework, UI, blah, blah, blah. We know what those are. So they created React components out of all of their different modules. So you can load in React Bootstrap, and then you get access to button modules and navigation and blah, 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 all pre-styled as Bootstrap is. But you just have to pass in the text items that you need and how things need to interact. But the actual markup and the styling are automatically taken care of. Similarly, there are things like Chartist and Chart.js. I love data visualization, so these two are super, super fun for me. What you end up getting if you use Chart.js's React library is you can just import specific styles of graphs and then just render a donut, for example, a donut element, and just pass in the data that you need. Everything else is done for you. You can also pass in an options hash and just like provide it any overrides that you want, but at its core, it became super, super easy to integrate any of these things into your React apps. Just incredibly sped up the process for development. GraphQL. Okay, so GraphQL doesn't necessarily work. It's not only for React. It's a query language similar to REST or the Poopy Soap. REST is sort of like the default that developers are using today. So to illustrate the power of GraphQL, I'll sort of just like walk through a quick example of, let's say, heroes and friends. Now, quite often let's say this was revolved around Star Wars, and let's say I want to find out all the friends of Luke Skywalker. So what you would normally do, or quite traditionally what you would see, is you would have two different API endpoints. One would help you retrieve all the information that you would need about a particular hero, and then now that you have that data, like let's say the hero's name or something, you make another API request to another endpoint to retrieve that particular hero's friends. So as things get more and more complex, as Anna was mentioning, like their app has like 20 endpoints, and it just gets crazier and crazier and crazier. The more endpoints you have, the more data that you need that relies on each other. So with GraphQL instead, you sort of create a JSON object without any values. It's just a whole bunch of keys. And that's sort of like the schema that you define for GraphQL. And you say, hey, this is the information I want. And you just make one API call in this particular fashion, and it returns in JSON. And you've got all those values filled out. Super, super crazy. I was like, pfft. When I saw this for the first time, I was like, how does this even work? And one of the things that came about was something called Relay, and that essentially controls how and when to fetch data, especially when you're using GraphQL. It's a pretty complex and very, very large subject in itself, so I highly recommend diving into that if you're interested in simplifying, improving the performance of a very, very complex app. GraphQL is something that we're exploring quite heavily at Shopify as well, so I highly recommend looking into that. And there was tons and tons and tons more stuff that has already been released. There's just not enough time for me to cover them. It was already very difficult to select the ones that I had to. So a question then arose, like, which ones should I use? Like, if I'm starting to do React development today, I know a bit of JavaScript, I want to learn how React works, which ones of those should I use? Don't use any of them. I just wasted your time. Just completely toss out. I'm kidding. So you don't need any of those to get started. There's absolutely no reason to use any one of those except React edit in itself. The way that I started learning React, it's like people think it's ridiculous, but I created a blank HTML document, and I just loaded the two script files that I needed for React and React DOM, created a script tag, and started writing my JavaScript there. So it was like the most ghetto, like no fancy tooling, absolutely nothing, bare bones way of getting up and running. It was not performant, it was not like ready to be deployed at any point in time, but I got coding in React within like 30 seconds, and that's what I needed, and that's what I wanted. So if you're a little bit more comfortable with tooling beyond that, then the React Create app is fantastic and solves those problems to make something that's very quick and easy to use, but is also ready to create development, production level code. You have to be very, very smart. You need to include what you need and when you need it. This is in itself a very, very difficult thing to do. Don't underestimate the complexities that come around with apps. This is sort of why tech leads and architects at agencies and companies are so important, because they're there to visualize what's supposed to happen in the future. How will things escalate? How will the complexities develop in our app? And sort of try and predict some of that stuff early on, and bring those things in at the right opportune moment. So the app that I worked on at Shopify, the team that I work on is called the Buy Button team. That allows us to embed products in non-Shopify websites. So static websites, WordPress, whatever. And the new builder interface that we created was built in React. When we first started, there was no Redux, there was nothing fancy, there was no React router, there was nothing. It was just React. And as we built, we realized, oh, hey, we need a little bit of this, we need a little bit of that. Then we had decisions to be made and like discussions about each of those concepts. And slowly but surely, we started adding in more tooling to fill in those blanks. So there's no point in adding things in before you even need them. It's just completely unnecessary. So, to close things off, I wanted to shift focus into something a little bit different and just talk about our industry as a whole. Our industry is growing incredibly fast. It is insane how fast our industry is growing. There's more and more people getting into web development with the rise of boot camps and all sorts of stuff. It's becoming very, very easy to become a developer as well, which is awesome. And there's so much cool tech that's being released continuously. Our reputation, on the other hand, not so much. It's still quite unfortunately looked at as a bunch of dudes sitting around coding away, just eating a bunch of chips and being gross. The more you look at it, the more hands you start seeing. It's insane. Anyways, it's definitely getting better. Or unfortunately, like, so I thought. It just seemed it was getting better. Everyone's talking more about it. There's like more and more boot camps happening. It's super fancy. It's super great. I attended an event some months ago that was actually put on by Anna called Advice to My Younger Self. And one of the stats that was revealed to me at this event was that the improvement in diversity in tech as a whole was so small. So small. And I was blown away. And I'm just like so bummed out that here I was thinking like, oh, this is happening, and we're solving problems left, right, and middle. This is fantastic and so great. But at a very high level, looking at the industry as a whole, it was still terrible. So there's still tons and tons of work to do. So I asked at the meetup there, what can we do? For example, what can I do as a dude to help improve this stuff? And as a person, help improve the diversity in the industry that we all belong to. And the one thing that they said was highlight and promote one another. It's so awkward for me to talk about stuff that I've made and I've done, which is why there was no screenshots of any of the things I did. I just skipped over everything in one slide. But it's so easy for me to tell someone else how awesome a thing is that so-and-so made or so-and-so made. It's a lot easier to help promote other people's stuff. And it's so valuable to do. Especially highlight those people's voices who may not be heard as much in the industry. Shopify has a motto where you say, do things, tell people. All of us do a lot of things, but not enough of us tell people. And we should all be helping tell people about things that we've all made as a collective. Our industry is super weird. It is super weird. And to explain how weird it is, I want to tell you a story about my dad. So my dad works in he's a geologist, and he works for a very big, he used to work for a very big corporation. He's retired now. And him and I were chatting. He was like, oh, hey, so that app you built a little while ago, how's that doing? I was like, oh, pretty good. He's like, yeah, how many users do you have? I was around a couple of thousand now. He's like, oh, that's really cool. How much money are you making off it? I was like, minus $14. He was like, what do you mean? I was like, oh, I gotta pay for hosting, gotta pay for Heroku, gotta pay for my domain name. He was so upset with me. He was like, why are you charging $0? What is this? What is this insanity? And I was like, that's sort of like the mindset as a whole in our industry. Everyone is so willing to share and give things away for free. Just look at all the things that we spoke about today, cost nothing. Everything is open source. Our community is bonkers. This is so weird for anyone not in the tech industry, where everything's all about licensing and not sharing and like blah, 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 this and that. Web is so weird and so cool, and it's important for us to share that and educate everyone else around the world about how awesome this is. We almost end up taking these things for granted. Like, this tool is $2? Nah. Like, we forget how awesome we have it, where most of our stuff is for free. I remember people would get really annoyed at Sublime Text who are giving you the pop-up on every 20th save to buy it. Or like, why does it keep asking me to do that? Well, it's for free. So it's really cool, and we should like continuously make sure that we're striving to share and like build this awesome community around us. I'm always down to chat. I love having like hardcore emotional conversations about the industry, about any tech, just about like life in general as a developer. Our friends down south are having a pretty rough time these days, and it's important to remember that we're all people. Now more than ever, we need to remember that we are all people, even if it's just like someone's message on Stack Overflow. Whoever was writing that is still a person. Just because they were being a butthole doesn't mean you have to be one as well. Everyone has opinions. And opinions matter and are so different and diverse, and we learned that quite intensely over the past couple of months. And now more than ever, we need to be kind to one another. You can have a completely different opinion and have a discussion, but there's absolutely no reason why you need to be a butt about it. So with that, be kind, and thank you. All right, and we have around 10 minutes or so for questions, so if anyone wants to chat, I'm happy to do so. Yes?
I really enjoyed your presentation, but there's a small typo in your slide deck.
Oh, hit me up.
So when you were talking about Xcode, you said C# and Swift.
Yes.
Objective-C and
Oh, sorry, yes, absolutely, my bad. Thank you. Whew, late night slideshow making's not a good, yeah, appreciate that, thank you. So, tell us more about my dad? I've never been asked that before. That's wild. He's cool. He's a cool cat. We can chat later.